If you ever use Photomatix Pro to create HDR images, you may find, particularly if you use the tone mapping option, that your images have a sort of dreamy, hazy look to them when they come out. Here's an example of an HDR image that we processed with about 12 original images into an HDR, and it looks a little bit dreamy for my taste. So I want to add some localized contrast to make the details pop a little bit better. This technique is one that you can use using Photoshop or Photoshop Elements to enhance your photos or to fix this problem. So I'm going to start in my layers panel, and I need to duplicate the layer that I'm working on. So I'm going to right click on it and choose duplicate layer. I don't care what it's called, so I'll just click through. And before I actually get into the meat of this, I need to give you a little bit of a rundown on a filter that, unless you do techniques like this, you probably have never used before. It's the high pass filter. So it's under Filter, Other, and you always know that something's not terribly helpful in most instances when they just group it in the Other category, and High Pass. And you'll notice that it basically turns my image gray. Now, what high pass does is it looks at the image. If you set it to the lowest setting, it turns everything to middle gray. And as you move this slider up, you'll notice that detailed areas start to emerge, and areas with little details still remain middle gray. So we can use this to target the areas that are edges and other areas of detail, so that we can add contrast to those areas and just leave it out of other areas, which will give us the impression of greater sharpness. So I'm going to cancel out of that, I'm going to go to my blend mode here. That's this drop-down menu that says normal. I'm going to choose overlay. Now the overlay blend mode has a contrast enhancing feature. What it does is it takes everything that's brighter than middle gray and makes it brighter, and everything that's darker than middle gray and makes it darker. And anything that's middle gray just more or less vanishes. So if we use that filter, which we're going to get to from Filter, Other, High Pass, if I set this to pretty much nothing, it's going to have no effect. If I start to move this up, you'll see that now my image gets more contrast. As I sort of move it down into the middle, it's got more localized contrast. In this case, I want to have it so that the large detail areas, say like a large patch of shadow and a large patch of highlight, sort of all become little regions. You'll see, instead of seeing halos inside of them, they all just basically turn into areas that sort of pop out. Now this number can be usually somewhere between 80 and 120. If you're using a super high resolution camera like a Nikon D800, it might be higher than that. If you're using a lower resolution camera, it might be lower. I'm using an 18 megapixel camera, so that's kind of my sweet spot. In this case, I'm going to go to about 125 pixels or so. And it might look a little crunchy, so what I can do is I'm going to fade the opacity back to 0, and then I'm going to walk this back up until I feel it's got just the right amount of pop to it. And of course, that's going to be a judgment call, so you might need to practice a bit and kind of see what, where you settle in. So I'm going to go for high 80s here. And if I'm in Photoshop Elements, I would probably need to flatten down the images. So I'd go to my Layers panel and flatten, and then I'd repeat this process. But since I'm using Photoshop Elements, I'm just going to keep, or Photoshop, not Photoshop Elements, I'm going to keep all my layers. So I'm just going to select this top layer and press a keyboard shortcut. It is Command, Option, Shift and E if you're on the Mac, Control, Alt, Shift and E if you're on the PC. Basically, you're using all the modifier keys and then the letter E. So that creates a copy of these two images merged together. And I want to change the blend mode on that one also to overlay. And then I want to run that same filter again. Now, here's a little trick. If you ever need to run the same filter you ran last time, but you actually want to still change the settings, you can press Control Alt F if you're on a PC, and if you're on a Mac, Command Option F, and it'll call up the dialog box. So if you see the same settings we used last time are making things look, well, rather hideous. So I'm going to lower that down. I want to see sort of the size details start to pop in this. And in this case, I'm looking at somewhere in the 10 or 13. Oftentimes it's up to about 16 that I'd go. And then I'd click OK. And then I'm going to reduce the opacity down to 0 and sort of walk this back up until I think it looks its best, which is right about there. I've got 64%. Oftentimes I'm around 50% when I do that. And then I want to do this sort of business one more time. So I'm going to press Command Option Shift E, change the blend mode again to overlay. I'm going to press Command Option F or Control Alt F to bring up the last dialog box. If I can't remember my keyboard shortcuts, I would just go to Filter, Other, High Pass. And then I'm going to reduce this down, and this time I'm just going to do a little touch of extra sharpening. So I want a low value, somewhere in the 1 to 2 range. This 1.5 is looking pretty good right here, so I'm going to click OK. Now, one problem that I've got is I have darkened the edge right here, and this is sometimes a case. Something sometimes goes wrong with the edges when you use this technique, so you might have to crop that away, or you might try and just brighten this using like dodging or an adjustment layer and a layer mask. But what I've got here is a much improved image. If I hold my Alt or Option key and click on the eyeball beside background image, you can see that's what I started with, and that's where I've gotten to. So this image just pops so much more. You know, I might want to go and fix some other things with this image, but this is definitely a much more appealing image than it was when we started this. So if you find you have that dreamy look for your HDRs coming out of Photomatix, here is the way that you can go about fixing that without having to buy any additional plugins or anything like that.